welcome to another episode of Elevate Your Grind, brought to you by the Cannabis Lab. I've got a great guest today that unfortunately was supposed to be on Facebook Live, but Facebook is not cooperating with us today. So we're going to record this podcast and put it out at a later date. But this is some great information you don't want to miss. My guest today was voted the top cannabis lawyer by Chambers USA and a cannabis law trailblazer by the National Law Review. Please welcome John Robbins of Akerman.
Hey, Todd, happy to be here. And thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much for joining me. So, John, I know you have 3 kids. How are you holding up during the lockdown?
Holding up pretty well. My kids have not killed me yet. I have a 19-year-old, a 16-year-old, and a 12-year-old. So it's been challenging to say the least. But I think perhaps for us is that we're keeping completely different hours. They go to bed at 7 in the morning and wake up at 5 o'clock in the afternoon most days. And I'm about the opposite. So it's been keeping us sane to the extent that we could stay sane. We're dealing.
Well, yeah, I know you're a very busy guy. So let's get right into kind of the questions here. So one of the things I'm really interested about since this whole pandemic hit was the investment side of our industry, right? So I know that you have a deep background in financial services and you get involved on the financial side of our business a lot. A lot of people were saying before COVID-19 hit that the cash in our industry was dry. I took the stance that people just were getting smarter with their investment, but now with COVID hitting and most people losing money in their portfolios, is there capital out there? Are people making investments in cannabis?
It's a good question. I would not say that the capital sources have completely dried up. I think that investors have gotten a little more savvy over the last couple of years, and the excitement of the green rush that you heard and read about, 3 or 4 years ago has died down a little bit. Historically, the industry has been financed heavily with private money because traditional funding sources simply aren't available because of marijuana's existence still to this day as a Schedule I substance under the Federal Controlled Substances Act. So you can't go to the bank and get a traditional loan to build a cultivation facility, at least not one in the United States, not yet. And so the industry has been heavily financed by high net worth individuals, by private equity groups, by private family offices, and many of those entities and individuals got in and got out and did very, very well. Right now, I would certainly say, obviously, I don't think anything in anybody's portfolio right now is doing particularly well because of the environment that we're in right now. But I would say that deal flow did slow down a bit before Corona, and that I think is a function of a bit of a sort of an adjustment or a correction more than anything else. The industry is certainly not going anywhere. I think that many of the companies that we deal with are extremely, first of all, they're well capitalized, but they're also extremely well run and very successful. And so, you had a situation where companies were really expanding rapidly, presumably to position themselves as acquisition targets for whenever the day is that the feds loosen the reins, so to speak. And so much like you saw with Constellation, potentially getting into the industry when the laws change, I think a lot of people were trying to go on an acquisition tear, become multi-state operators, and in doing so, they leverage themselves, either with debt or equity. And so that debt has to be serviced, and you'd see earlier investors who might not have been seeing the returns that they had hoped for because you have companies that are acquiring other companies and taking on debt and giving out more equity, and so the pace of that slowed a bit, as given that at least right now there's no relief in sight from the feds in terms of marijuana being descheduled. And B, you had a lot of investors who would put money into the market and they're saying, hey, well, where are my returns? Typically, again, they're sophisticated investors. They get it. They understand how this works. And so the available money for the industry had I'm not going to use the term dried up, but there definitely was a bit of a slowdown. But there's always alternatives. So, for example, uh, when when perhaps equity deals are slowing down, you're starting to see sale leasebacks and other type of debt deals that come up. So um, the industry will continue to be well financed. Right now, things have slowed down a bit, and there will be a bit of a correction. And on the hemp side, uh, a lot of what we've seen perhaps has to do with competition, because once the Farm Bill was amended to effectively remove CBD as a Schedule One substance under the Controlled Substances Act, a lot of people got into the CBD business or the hemp business. The
Mhm.
barrier to entry is a lot lower than marijuana in most jurisdictions. And so there was an influx into the market. And of course, I would suggest that what we're seeing is a readjustment period right now. I can tell you, I don't believe that marijuana or hemp or CBD are going anywhere. And in fact, on the hemp side, we haven't even begun to realize the potential yet, because people are focusing on CBD and not necessarily as much on the industrial uses of hemp, which are absolutely tremendous.
I couldn't agree with that statement more. And there's so many tangents I'd love to go down based on what you just told me. But let's ride that last one that you just put out there. People don't realize that the hemp plant and the farm bill and everything else that has to do with the quote unquote hemp side of the industry, even though it's just a low THC cannabis plant, is really so much more excited than CBD. Like, listen, CBD is great and it has some great therapeutic tendencies and it does really good things for people from a wellness standpoint. But we haven't gotten into hemp fibers, hemp products. I saw someone come out with a hemp straw that I can't understand why Starbucks wouldn't adopt that immediately, given we've both had a Starbucks in recent time, how terrible those paper straws are, right? You get to see a lot of great companies because you guys help form them, you help them do their documentation, you guys help them get licensed and everything else. Are you seeing a lot of companies starting to say, hey, either hey, the CBD space is crowded, we don't need to be there, or just forget CBD, let's go into the fiber side of the business, let's go into the hempcrete side of the business? Are people getting ready to make that move?
It's an interesting dynamic. I can't necessarily, predict exactly what people are doing, but I could tell you what I'm seeing is, first of all, with respect to CBD, um, there were several big companies, big public companies, vitamin companies, nutraceutical companies that got involved in the business, that have a network of distributors and retailers. But what might not have been expected is that a lot of mom and pop operations have also gotten into that end of the business. So again, nothing to do with the viability of CBD and the potential therapeutic benefits of CBD. That's all fantastic, but everybody seemed to have jumped in that direction from the get go. Especially now, as there's been more competition and prices have come down. And I can tell you that if you're looking to source isolate or distillate type products, the prices are dramatically lower than they were some time ago. So people were focused on that. But yes, I'm starting to finally see people also start to change focus and think about the other industrial uses of hemp, be it for construction purposes, for fiber, for clothing. Uh, the straws at Starbucks, great example. That's something. I mean, this is a crop that people have used for thousands and thousands of years, and only over the last 80 to 100 years has it been taboo. And now people are
Mhm.
starting to realize the benefits, and we're going to see that end of the market explode, particularly as different types of technology and extraction technology continue to develop.
I think it's incredible. And that's the part of the business that really, really excites me. So let's stay on this topic and back to CBD, because, I know that you guys have been involved with a lot of CBD companies. We don't need to talk about companies or anything that you guys are doing there, but I'm very interested because you deal with a lot of regulations and you've always dealt with regulatory bodies in your line of work. How you know, obvious the FDA has put out regulations on CBD. The states have their own programs, but how does one approach regulating a product like CBD, where it's just in such a gray area, right? It's marijuana's you know, sober friend. It's put out there for wellness. It's put out there for medicine. It's a food supplement. You know, there's so many different industries that it can touch. And then on top of that, there's so many people that are out there that are just unfortunately putting out bold-faced lies. Obviously, the packaging requirements happen to do that. But what do you even look at to begin to make a model to regulate CBD? And do you believe, and if you can't answer this because I know you're involved in a lot, that's fine. Do you believe it needs to be more regulated or less regulated at this point?
It's a good question. I like, by the way, CBD is marijuana's. What did you say? Marijuana's
Marijuana's sober friend.
sober friend. Marijuana's more legitimate cousin.
There
Um,
you go.
this is and will continue to be a highly regulated industry. I believe it should be highly regulated, and in fact, I'll say the same thing about marijuana. I'd much rather see a highly regulated industry to uh, so you know what people are getting, you know what people are ingesting, and be it CBD, marijuana, or really anything else. So I'm certainly all for regulation, and I think that's going to do a lot as things progress and as the market matures to do away with the black market, which is a very dangerous proposition. As we saw, people aren't talking about it as much anymore, but you know, before the coronavirus, we were talking about vaping illnesses
Yeah.
and people who were suffering devastating effects of black market, typically black market THC cartridges. So I don't have a problem at all with lots of reasonable regulation. The problem is that um, and more so with marijuana, but even with hemp, there's a disconnect between state and federal regulation. They're not always on the same page. And again, even with respect to hemp, which is not illegal under federal law for the most part. Um, the problem that I have been seeing is that even regulators are having a hard time wrestling with this industry, understanding their way around it. There is a fundamental uh, misunderstanding or confusion, I would say, in the public about the difference between hemp and marijuana. And even the most, savvy of people, if you look at certain hemp crop and a crop of marijuana, you can't necessarily tell the difference. There's a lack of uniformity in testing. There's a lack of uniformity in labeling and disclosures. And so, again, as the industry matures, the regulatory schemes will mature, people will understand. And in fact, we're dealing with clients that have had, just focusing on CBD for a sec, we're dealing with clients who have now had to deal with some regulatory issues with the state of Florida, either because, and I'm not talking about the FDA right now, obviously we've dealt with that and everybody's read about that, but issues where the state of Florida has pulled products off of shelves, have tested it, and have made a determination that the representation, not a representation as to curative properties or therapeutic properties, but a representation as to one dose is 50 milligrams of CBD, are not necessarily in the eyes of the regulator accurate, and potential regulatory action, these purveyors face. Stop sale orders have been issued, and the problem is that there seems to be, again, a lack of uniformity, particularly with respect to testing. So I'm familiar with a specific situation where we had a client. They were above and beyond compliant in terms of, from a regulatory perspective. They had their product tested multiple times. Then the Department of Agriculture tested some of their products, and their test results were not consistent with our clients' test results. And these are independent third-party labs. And there's even, people don't even know at this point whether, there is some speculation, I should say, that CBD is not a stable product and could potentially deteriorate over time. So in other words, you may have a bottle of a tincture Your lab test results and what you say on your label are exactly what they were. In fact, perhaps even better than what you said on your label when you sell the product. And 6, 7, 8 months later, product pulled off the shelves may not still have that same potency. I don't know if that's necessarily the case, but I could tell you that there's some speculation among regulators that that might be the case. And if in fact that is, you can imagine the havoc it's going to wreak on the industry, because um, once product leaves a manufacturer or seller's hands, they no longer have the ability to test the product or to make a representation as to the exact nature of the product. So you're going to probably find people that are in a situation where they're on the other end of a regulatory investigation or proceeding when in their minds they should not be, and regulators might disagree. I mean, this is something we've been seeing for a while. I mean, you're probably familiar with the case in Arizona that goes back a year or so, where people were transporting hemp plants through the state. I think it was Arizona, and ultimately it was confiscated. And there was a big issue about whether or not it met the THC requirements for it to be hemp rather than marijuana. But in the meantime, the product has a shelf life. It deteriorates over time. You can't use it at some point. And so the regulations have to continue to evolve like any other regulated industry, and they will. But right now, I'm not going to say it's a bit of the Wild West, but it's certainly uncharted territory, particularly for attorneys like me who have been doing regulatory work for years and years. I've represented, before I was doing this, I was representing people who were being investigated or sued by the securities regulators. But you're dealing with well-evolved rules and regulations and well-evolved court decisions that have interpreted those rules and regulations, which is something that we just don't have yet for this industry. I don't
No,
know
it
if that
definitely
answers
makes
your question, by the way, at all, but
it
I
does.
apologize for rambling.
No, it answers my question, and it kind of led to what I was going to ask next, which is nice. You know, with the issues that you brought up, most CBD companies are white labeling from another company, so there's a supply chain involved. So if the potency is going to be different based on where on the supply chain that you test, to me, you're right. There needs to be more regulations that kind of support that, because the last person on the supply chain is always going to be the one who gets it the worst, in my opinion. Is
Game of
that a
hot
lot of what
potato.
you guys are dealing with?
We are, and you're right. And there is a supply chain, and by the way, again, I have seen nothing to necessarily support that position that CBD is unstable or degrades over time. It's just a conversation that I have had with regulators where there's some speculation that that might be the case, which again makes things a little more challenging. But the excitement of dealing with something new and novel and sort of uncharted waters is also there. So that makes up for it for me.
No, and I think the cool thing too is folks like yourself and the team that you have, and I think you have an amazing team, and we can, Ari and Zach
Great team.
and what do you have, what, 22 people on your team right now, or has it grown, or am I pulling that number out of thin air?
No, we well, it certainly has grown. Um, we launched our cannabis practice. Akerman launched its cannabis practice, I should say, in mid 2014. It's something that I had been working on with the management of the firm since very early 2014. And I'm in Florida. It started in Florida. We sort of timed it to coincide with the first Charlotte's Web law, the high CBD, low THC law. That was the first law in the books in Florida. But over time, because of our national presence, we've had the opportunity, and we've been lucky enough to attract some really fantastic people in Chicago, in New York, in again Florida, in California. And so, geez, on our email distribution list, we probably have well over 20 to probably twice that many people who within the firm have worked on CBD or cannabis related or marijuana related matters. But I would say the core team is probably between 15 to 20 people right now. And Zach, Coburn very well, and you know Ari Gersten very well, who Ari's been with me since I started this back in 2014, and he's just amazing. And Coburn, we were lucky enough to snatch from one of the existing. He was in house at one of the existing MMTCs down here in Florida, and Zach has an absolute ton of institutional knowledge with respect, particularly in Florida, but not limited to Florida, with respect to the marijuana industry. So we were so lucky to get Zach, and then in California, we have some folks. My partner Josh Mandel and Iran Hopkins in our LA office. Iran's been doing this for longer than I have. Her clients just adore her. They really know their stuff, and that's a market, by the way, that probably makes Florida look easy to tackle because the regulations in California are first of all, it's marijuana is regulated on a local level like it's not down here, and so to have a group that really understands the industry, that has some history in the industry. By the way, I don't think I even mentioned Colorado and Kristen
Yep.
Morris there, who's been doing this for years as well, and just really understands the nature of the regulatory program in Colorado. So we're real lucky. And, now we're starting to see some other national firms launch cannabis practices. They're coming in slowly. And some really great attorneys and great firms that we get the opportunity to work with on the other side of matters now too.
No, you're the team that you put together is incredible. I actually got to spend some time with Iran in San Diego, with my past job, and then again down in Mexico for Count of Mexico, and she was just a
Yeah,
wealth of information.
right.
And you have Zach on your team, and luckily we are not on Facebook Live, or I can tell you he'd probably be blowing up my phone trying to get me to look at it or laugh or something behind the scenes, because that's what Zach does.
That's what Zach does.
So it's
Zach's got
probably
two
for the
grade
best.
school Zach's got two grade school kids at home who are so he's been fortunate enough to not have to deal with sort of the homeschooling. My kids are I wind them up and they go, so they could deal with it, and they're asleep till 5 o'clock every afternoon anyway at this point. But Zach's got his hands full because he's Zach and his wife have been trying to corral these kids for 6 weeks now.
Yeah, he had to escape to his wife's office when we did the podcast. I'm like, oh yeah, sure, escape. Oh, honey, I really have to do this podcast. I'm like, you just wanted a moment to yourself.
Everybody deserves
So
a moment. There'll be lots of
we all
babies and
do.
lots of divorces after we're done with this, I would imagine.
Oof, yeah, you're telling me. My wife actually just finally caved on getting takeout as of yesterday, so I'm really excited to start getting food that I didn't cook.
Oh, you haven't eaten food from
Ooh.
any
No,
restaurant?
so because we have the 6-month-old, and I know we'll get back to cannabis eventually, but these are more fun to talk about because we had the 6-month-old. She's worried about, she hasn't had all of her flu shots yet, so she's been
Okay.
really, really careful about what we've been doing. So even though, most of the people on the news says, okay, we've been really careful not to get takeout, and then finally she kind of hit the quarantine wall yesterday, and she's like, I'm over this. All right, I want Tijuana Flats.
Well, I mean, it certainly makes sense, particularly with a baby in the house. It's my infrequent trips to Publix or to curbside delivery is about all I got, all I got right now. So I need to get out, at least take a drive.
Yeah,
You have to do it for your mental well-being.
yeah.
So I'm
So
glad you're gonna
let's
I'm glad you're gonna get. I hope you and your wife are good cooks because it sounds like you guys have been
Yeah,
hands
I
on a
mean,
lot.
we do okay. The problem is when you do the orders from Publix instead of curbside, do the Instacarts and the shipped, and apparently I'm giving out a lot of free plugs here. You don't always get the ingredients you want.
Nope.
So it's kind of like playing guys grocery games where you just got to make what you can with what shows up.
Well, there's been a lot of one thing has been a lot of good between television and the internet, great recipes and great ideas that I would have never. And I like to cook, so I would have never even thought of. So um, I'm enjoying that. I was up last night and like 10:30 grilling steaks because like I said, my kids their schedules are so out of whack. It's thrown all of us out of whack.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's not easy. Um, so let's circle back because we've picked your brain a little bit, and it's usually opposite of what I do. But the last question you had mentioned, you were started working on building the cannabis practice out for Akerman in 2014, right? It's not like you were working on anything boring before that. You were working with clients that were being pursued by the SEC. You deal with a lot of financial regulatory environments. That's exciting work. It's lucrative work. It's work that can score you on the opposite side of somebody in a movie like Wolf of Wall Street potentially. But you decided to go into cannabis. What did you happen to come across a client where did you get somebody in the industry already? What led you to believe that this was going to be the next big practice for Akerman?
Yeah, I wish. By the way, I represented a couple of guys who were depicted in Wolf of Wall Street that went on after Stratton Oakmont to form another firm. So some of the folks who portrayed some of the attorneys in that movie, I know. And it was exciting, and it is interesting work. And I did a lot of commercial litigation over the years, but a definite emphasis on securities litigation and regulatory and enforcement work. And you're right, it's not boring. There are always great stories, things that are the stuff movies are made of. My foray into cannabis is not particularly glamorous or exciting. I was literally sitting in my office one day, got a call from a real estate client that had um, just a couple questions. They own properties. They had been approached about leasing space this was out west at the time, to a marijuana company, and they just generally had some questions about it. And candidly, I didn't know anything about it at the time, so I did a little research. It was very interesting, and it is as simple as getting home that night, having a conversation with my wife, and telling her, oh, I got the most interesting call today. And then it evolved into a conversation where, we started talking about what this industry might look like several years down the road. And it was actually my wife's suggestion, you should really approach the CEO of your firm about seeing whether they would consider a cannabis practice group, given what it looks like, given what we see happening out west, and that tidal wave starting a little bit to move east at that point. And so I started to do some research. I approached the CEO of the firm a couple of days later. Uh, he's no longer running the firm, but he's still with us, Andrew Smullian. And Andrew, to my shock and surprise, was actually open to the idea. I thought I'd get shut down real quick, but he said, "Look, if we could do this ethically, and we can represent clients in this space without getting either the firm or our clients into trouble, then we're certainly willing to look into it." And so there were several months of uh, figuring out whether, in fact, for example, we would be violating rules of professional conduct by representing clients who are technically violating federal law, regardless of what's going on in state law. Is that, Zach?
No,
I'm
that's not
kidding.
actually. My daughter was just crying in the background. That's my wife asking if it can be heard on camera.
We're good. You know what? This is the best of some of the stuff I've seen on Zoom these days. If your kid's crying, that's the least we have to worry about. I've seen some pretty
Oh,
funny videos. So it really evolved from there. We had to give some thought in terms of what type of disclosures we need to make to clients. What type of uh, intake process there's going to be to vet these clients. And one thing I will say, and one thing that I've learned over several years of representing clients who are technically operating in violation of federal law. I will say that for the most part, the people that I work with are extremely transparent and compliant, and they want to cross the T's. They want to dot the I's. I can't necessarily say that, by the way, about all of my securities clients that I've
yeah.
represented in the past. And so I find that particularly refreshing, and they get it. They understand that. Look, and sometimes you're dealing with people who may have been operating in the black market for years. Not so much here, but out west, for example. And so these are people who are not used to having to deal with regulatory hurdles, and not used to having to deal with ridiculous tax laws, and the inability to take certain deductions, and the inability to secure insurance at a reasonable rate. Things are getting better and things are progressing, but I can tell you,
Yeah.
when I first started doing this, it wasn't easy for a lot of these folks. And so I would say that almost everybody I work with has a really phenomenal attitude, and they want to do it right because they know everybody's watching.
Yeah, and it's interesting seeing the types of people that are running this company. And I've always kind of had this idea that, there's a lot of people out there that you said were operating on the black market, and they wear that as a badge of honor. And I commend them for doing what they did for so long and being able to get medication into the hands of patients, right? Because at the end of the day, this is a medical standpoint too. But I always wonder when you're investing in a company and you're looking at operators, um, black market guys, they understand the cannabis side of the business, but they're not used to working in a regulated environment. Actually, they're used to working around the regulations because they're used to working around the law. From what you've seen, is it helpful to be in that position, or could it be potentially hurtful for someone who has that?
I think it could cut either way, and it's a very valid observation. Um, Again, what I have seen are folks that are not necessarily, you know, the most sophisticated of business people, particularly if they're people who were, perhaps operating in the shadows previously. They're not used to dealing with private family offices or high net worth individuals, private equity groups. But I certainly have seen this appetite to learn, to evolve, to mature, and to do that. And in fact, that's what I'm seeing because I could tell you. I mean, you go to MJ Biz, right?
Mhm.
The first year I went, I guess it was 2014. Back then, it was at the Rio Hotel. It was a small conference with like 2 or 3 thousand people, and a lot of the exhibitors were, beautiful glass blown uh, bongs and other delivery devices, and so it was a market that was just starting to mature at that point. Now, if you went to Vegas in December for MJ Biz, and hopefully we'll get to go this December, they had thirty
Mhm.
thousand people there, and you're dealing with not only business people who are incredibly sophisticated, and then operators who have now become very sophisticated, but you're dealing with a lot of mainstream companies that Scott's, for example,
Yeah.
would never have thought about this industry years ago. I mean, think about the constellations of the world, and so it's really exciting to see that. And I have definitely contact with many people who not very long ago they were they could tell you anything that you wanted to know about the plant, the cannabis plant. They are truly artists, a lot of these people, and candidly know way more than I would ever know about the plant itself. I'm a lawyer. um, but now they're starting to, now you'll hear terms like EBITDA from these people, so it's
Yeah.
really interesting to see and exciting.
No, it's fun to watch the market mature. It really is. And I've only been in it for a year, and just to see the differences over the past year, it's incredible. Some of the articles that I've read from you in the past they're no longer valid just because things have changed. But I like seeing what you guys have done. Obviously, I met you about a year ago, but you and your team you're very instrumental right now in shaping the landscape of the Florida cannabis market, right? You guys have done a lot of work down here. To what extent can you share some of that with us? Because obviously it's known that you guys are involved in a few cases that should shape our industry going forward. Is there anything that you can share with us, or are we still behind closed doors on a lot of that?
No, no, a lot of what we're doing is, particularly if it's in the litigation realm, it's public information, and so I'm happy and in fact very proud to share with you a lot of this stuff. And by the way, thank you for the compliment. Um, Most people who are either in this industry in Florida or who have an interest in this industry in Florida sort of know what's going on and the way the law has evolved in Florida, starting with a failed constitutional amendment in 2014. But that amendment spurred the Florida legislature to pass at least a law back in 2014. They called it the Charlotte's Web Bill at the time. Again, it was for patients with very limited debilitating medical conditions. They would be allowed to take low THC, high CBD cannabis under only very limited circumstances and a very limited number of licenses. Originally, it was supposed to be 5. Were to be issued to, at that time, they called them dispensing organizations. Then in 2016, the constitutional amendment Amendment 2, did make its way through and passed with a very healthy 71% of the voters of the state of Florida passed it, which basically allowed the program to expand, allowed the expansion of the debilitating medical conditions that would allow a patient to be recommended marijuana by a qualified physician. Did call for the issuance of more licenses to companies down in Florida who could serve those patients. Then there was a great deal of litigation over the way the program was implemented, over the legislation that subsequently was passed after the constitutional amendment. And so that led to the filing of the flower-grown lawsuit, which I'm very, very excited to say is teed up for oral argument before the Supreme Court on May 6th. So next week, Ari and I handled the underlying trial, and our partner Kathy Giddings is one of the chairs of our appellate practice group, and she is amazing. So Kathy, who has been to the Supreme Court of Florida before, but never by Zoom, will be one of the first test cases next week, the very first day they're going to be doing this. And in fact, there's another marijuana-related case argued before the Supreme Court the same day, which is over the petition to get a ballot initiative for adult or recreational use. They didn't end up getting enough signatures, but there's still litigation over the language in the proposed amendment. And so the Florida case was really exciting because it effectively challenged the constitutionality of, or challenges, because it's still pending, the constitutionality of the implementing statutes and the manner in which the Department of Health Office of Medical Marijuana Use has been implementing the program. And specifically, if you look at the constitutional amendment and the intent document behind that constitutional amendment, it was very clear, and I'll say this from my biased perspective, it was very clear that there was no requirement for full vertical integration. But for those of you who might listen to this who don't know, full vertical integration is required by law in Florida. And what that means is effectively there is one company, one licensee that is responsible from literally seed to sale and cannot contract with any third party. So that means that you have to cultivate, you have to extract, you have to dispense, you even have to transport the product under the umbrella of one entity. And that has become an extremely competitive and extremely expensive proposition. And so you've probably heard about licenses in Florida selling for, $50 million and up, and they're still selling. There are still some licenses that have sold recently for perhaps not that much, but it's a very, very valuable golden ticket, so to speak, to have. Our client Flower Grown obviously was interested in obtaining a license to operate a medical marijuana treatment center. And one of the principals behind Flower Grown is somebody who's no stranger to litigation and controversy in the state of Florida, a guy named Joe Redner, who is a stage 4 lung cancer survivor as we speak. He is a raw vegan. His doctors have suggested to him that the best method of delivery for his medicine would be to juice it. And the way that the regulations work, it's just not practical to be able to do that. So Joe had another case where he challenged his right to be able to grow it at home. And this case is about this vertical integration requirement, as well as the caps on the number of licenses that would be allowed in Florida, because it's Flower Grown's position that the constitutional amendment does not require vertical integration, and in fact contemplated the different types of licenses. So for example, if you want to have a dispensary, but you don't have the wherewithal to be able to cultivate, you can have a dispensary and be able to buy product wholesale from another cultivator or or processor. So we won at the trial level. We made our way up to the First District Court of Appeal, Florida grown, and again the First District Court of Appeal, which is not necessarily you know I'm trying to say it fairly conservative, a fairly conservative group of people, did agree that the implementing statute was not consistent with the constitutional amendment, and therefore full vertical integration is not a requirement that should exist under Florida law. The Supreme Court's going to hear it next week. We're all very excited to learn. It'll affect the industry dramatically.
Yeah.
And if in fact the decision of the trial court in first DCA is upheld, then we're going to see some changes in the industry in Florida, and hopefully changes for the better in terms of the ability of competition, both on a price level, on a product level, and particularly with respect to individuals in underserved communities to be able to be served as more people enter the industry, and there's more product available, and again more competition, therefore uh, better pricing. And if ultimately Florida grown doesn't prevail, then we'll see what happens. Things will continue on the trajectory that it's on right now. But I think that we're going to see over the next couple of years a lot of growth and change and maturity in the industry. Colorado started, for example, as a market that required full vertical integration, and it didn't work. It wasn't practical, and ultimately, as the market matured, things changed. So that's what we're hoping will happen here. I'm very excited about Florida grown. Kathy is very excited. Ari is very excited. Ari has been, Ari,
Yep.
he's so passionate about this stuff. So he motivates me and gets me all excited. So we're really excited to see what happens next week.
I think it's really cool, and I think it's really important for our industry. I know a lot of us are very focused on what the outcome of that case is going to be, and it's going to be really interesting to see what our industry looks like after that happens, especially if you guys win, if
Yeah,
Florida
for
Grown
sure.
wins, right?
And sorry to interrupt you, but just to be clear,
Go.
in the Florida Run case, nobody is suggesting, nor are we seeking to take licenses away from anybody that already has
Yeah.
licenses. Nobody is trying to interfere with the operations of existing MMTCs, and nobody is suggesting that a company cannot be fully vertically integrated if it so chooses, like the existing Soterra, Parallel, and True Leaves, and MedMen and other licensees in Florida. If that's how they choose to do business, then they should certainly be allowed to do so. They have a foothold in. They are here. They're serving the market, and I fully expect and want them all to continue to do so. It's more an issue of just making sure that the laws are consistent with what the folks in Florida voted for.
I agree with that. And as someone who's a patient and a fan, I agree with you. I do not want to see any of the 14 or 15 companies that are operating in our state go away at all. I don't want to see them get broken up. I don't want to see them any different than they are today. I like them. I'm a fan. I purchase from them. Their delivery has been great. But like you said, I think there's room for competition. I think there's room for a free market. And I think there's room for people that don't have 8 figures in their bank account or have the ability to raise 8 figures to be able to successfully start a cannabis company here in Florida. And it makes sense, like you said, with the underserved markets. If I'm operating in the state of Florida and I have to put in 8 figures into a license and then, another 8 figures to build out my company, I'm going to start in Miami and Jacksonville and Orlando and Tampa. And that's where the most of my focus is going to be, because you've got to be able to hit the most amount of people. So the cities like, I don't know, I'll just name a couple that are probably wrong about, but Panama City, Oviedo, Lake City, Okeechobee, those places, I can imagine it's not easy to get medicine. And it's not the fault of the companies, but they have to make
No, not
money.
at all. Yeah, no, I agree with you. There are certainly there are certainly markets that are underserved here. It's getting better, for sure, because there are operators. Some of the main operators here have upwards of 40 dispensaries now, and actually last month we haven't talked about it much, and I haven't read much about it, but actually limit on the number of storefronts, dispensaries that could be open, actually sunsetted in April of this year. So there technically is no cap on the
Oh,
number, not on the number of licensees, but the number of stores that they can open. So hopefully things will get better. But there have been other challenges that have gotten in the way. Locally, municipalities have the right to ban dispensaries if they choose to do so. If they don't ban them, then they got to treat them like other retail pharmacies. Landlords and tenants have a lot of issues. There are a lot of considerations for people. So it's not always easy to find space or get space. There are a lot of things that make it a little bit more challenging and make it a little bit, or if not a lot more expensive. So, like you said, it'll be exciting to see how things continue to unfold. And I will say this: whatever happens in Flora Grown, I hope that we could certainly get on back on track because um, the Department of Health, because of the pending litigation, has not been accepting applications or issuing licenses. There were 8 licenses that were given out last year by way of a settlement of litigation, but none of the existing licensees actually applied after 2015. All of the existing licensees, well, the licenses have some licenses have been transferred, but the ultimate applicants for those licenses all applied in the first round back when they were DOs.
yeah.
And so it'll be, it'll be nice to see new entrants into the marketplace.
I'm excited. I think we need more choices. And U14, trust me, I'll still be a patient or a client or whatever you want to call me. But I think we always have room for more, especially in a state the size of Florida. There's one detail I wanted to touch on that you had mentioned. So you guys are going to be, talking about this in the Supreme Court via Zoom. When you watch movies and television, when you're defending something like this, there's always a big emphatic speech, right? Is that going to take away from what you guys can do, being you have to do it on Zoom? Or can we add in some like cool graphics and stuff to help you make your case?
Well, you could do whatever you want. The Florida Supreme Court's not going to do it. In fact, I've seen some test sort of shots of what it's going to look like, and it seems like they're going to be working with a green screen where they're going to try to simulate as much as possible from a video perspective, it looking like attorneys are standing in front of a podium addressing an appellate panel. How it'll work in practice, we'll see next week. But appellate argument, unlike trial, you don't typically see those sort of passionate speeches or grandstanding. It's a much different vehicle. Each side is limited severely in terms of its time for argument, and typically what happens, and I'm sure this will be no exception, is that you work really diligently, you plan out exactly what you want to say, you start, and then you have a panel of justices who they have questions and they have a right to ask those questions, and they have a right to do whatever they want pretty much. And so Kathy will get rolling next week, and most assuredly, she's going to get peppered with a flurry of questions, and she'll be, obviously dealing, and the DOH's counsel, of course, and she'll be dealing with answering those questions. So I don't think it's going to be that sort of injustice for all type of moment, but there certainly has been a lot of interest, and I would imagine a lot of people are going to be. You can watch it live, and I think that a
Oh,
lot of people
awesome.
are
Yeah,
going to.
we'll have to look at that because I imagine everybody who's a member of C Lab is going to want to see what's going on. I mean, with something we always corner you guys about. So,
Yeah.
do you know where they can find it yet?
I can send you a link
Cool.
after we get off, and if you want to circulate it or put it on the Facebook page, you could certainly do that.
Absolutely. That'd be great. Well, John, I know I hijacked a lot of your time. It's easy for me to do. There's a ton of things I can talk to you about, but there's one last topic I want to touch on before I let you go. Um, I came across this article that you had wrote, um, basically saying about edibles, right? And the reason I want to ask you is very selfish. I have friends who ask me about when we're going to have edibles all the time. Now we have things that are quote unquote ingestibles, but we don't have what's considered your traditional edibles in the sense of California or Oregon, right? Where are we with edibles? Because I saw the article that you wrote that when it was passed 2.5, 3 years ago, there was really nothing that banned edibles in it. There just were no guidelines, I guess, with the FDA around the food safety part of it. So are we going to see edibles
Excuse me.
anytime soon?
Well, that's a good question. I will tell you, when you're talking about edibles in terms of medical marijuana in Florida as opposed to CBD type products, it's, that's not the FDA we're dealing with. It's the state of Florida, the Department of Health, Office of Medical Marijuana Use. We have been waiting patiently, and patients have been waiting patiently for the rules for edibles to come out. The rulemaking process has begun, and I'm sure a lot of it has to deal with a lot of the most recent delay, at least, has to deal with Corona. Right now, it's obviously not the ideal working environment. So I don't have a crystal ball. I can't tell you when we're going to see edibles in Florida. I could tell you that pretty much all of the licensed MMTCs down here are ready, willing, able, have signed license agreements with companies that you may have heard of out west to be able to sell their products here in Florida, which is a whole challenge in and of
Hmm.
itself because, of course, these products can't be transported across state lines. Um, some companies have certainly uh, come up with products that have passed muster with the DOH in terms of being an ingestible or considered a tincture, while not, an edible in the traditional sense. So there are capsules people could take. I think one company even has suppositories that would certainly not be considered an edible. But I do know that a couple of MMTCs have lozenge type products, and I don't want to say mints because it's more of a tincture that you put under your tongue that would melt. If I say mint, it certainly implies edibles. And all these products have been approved. No product is being sold in any MMTC in Florida that has not been approved by the Department of Health. So the answer is, I believe that they're working on the rules. I would hope that we're going to see these rules before year end, and that these stores and that MMTCs are going to start being able to provide edibles to patients sometime within the next 6 months or so. But that's
Nice.
only a
Yeah,
guess.
I think it's something that needs to happen down here, not because of any kind of adult use type thing, but I believe that edibles certainly can be a better experience for certain people that they're not into smoking, or they're not into, any kind of inhalation tactic.
Well, not only
You know,
that, but alternative methods of administration are critical because think about you know many people who are medical marijuana patients are undergoing chemo, or they're cancer patients,
yeah,
and for example, you can imagine if you're dealing with a patient who has lung cancer, they're certainly not going to be able to smoke. That's the last thing in the world
yeah,
that they're going to want to be able, that they're going to do, that they want to do. And so to be able to have these alternatives like edible products, and even though there are some very good alternatives now, there are tinctures, there are concentrates that you could, for example, put with a syringe on a cracker, and if you're dealing with chemo, and it certainly will. The idea is that it'll help your appetite. But yes, the more methods. This is not a precise science, okay?
yeah.
And while I firmly believe in the efficacy of medical marijuana, I still think that a lot of research needs to be done. And you're also dealing with licensees, and they're dealing with different strains and different plants and different methodologies of extracting THC, but reintroducing terpenes back into the product. And all of these different, you know, methods of preparing a product that'll be ultimately consumed in one way or another by a patient may affect these patients differently, and one person may respond you know favorably to one MMTC's product over another's. And that's another reason why I think research is certainly critical, but also to be able to have that variety of products out there for patients, because what works for one person may not work for another is very important.
No, I agree with you on that. I mean, from a medical standpoint, I think we're all working back towards that. What is a standard dose, right?
Yep.
Um, and we're not there yet. And then that's what really needs to happen for this to truly be a medicine. Or at least it is truly medicine before it to be handled properly, right? So I agree with you. I think a lot of research needs to be done on the medical side, and I'm hoping that it starts to happen.
Me too. That makes two of us. Well, we have a lot of great stuff to look forward to.
Absolutely. Well, John, thank you so much for your time. I know you're a busy man. There's a million other things that we can talk about, and I'm sure we will in the future. Really
Yeah.
appreciate you spending the day with us.
It's my pleasure. And it's always good to see you and speak with you. And you look great and healthy. So I'm happy. I hope everybody else out there is doing all right, holding up well, and staying healthy. And I will speak with you soon. Take good care of yourself.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you everybody for watching another episode of Elevate Your Grind. I'm sorry we couldn't get this one to you live, but it was an amazing episode. Now you can watch it over and over again. Please stay tuned. We're going to go live most days at 2 p.m. So you can always find us www.facebook.com/Canna Business Group, or you can find us on the web at www.joinclab.com.